Good evening. I want to thank you one more time for joining me on my daily dose. I've not been able to record the last day or so because I took off on the Lord's Day to allow you to be able to worship with God. And I hope that you were encouraged by doing that much more than I could ever do, even using His Word. As far as my health goes the last few days, things have really gotten a lot better. My pain has eased off a good bit in my shoulder and my chest, that type of thing, as well as the fact that I've been able to walk more and more. As a matter of fact, the last day or so I've been able to walk 2 miles. And the best part about those 2 miles is that I was able to walk them straight through without taking a breath. And on one day, yesterday, I actually walked 3 miles. I walked 2 miles, then stopped for about 15 minutes, got up, walked another mile, came on back to the room. So that's a blessing within itself. Went to the doctor this morning for my follow-up that I go to every Monday morning. And as I was there, I found out all of my blood work is absolutely perfect once again. So I've had 3 weeks of perfect blood work, 2 weeks of perfect biopsy with no ejection. So that's absolutely a great success. That means that things are going along just as well as they ought to, if not much better. And so I want to thank you for your prayers on that behalf. We want to turn our attention back now to the spiritual things that we often go to. And I want you to go back to a context we've been discussing already for 2 days, and Lord willing, we'll conclude here in just a moment. It comes from Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. If you would read with me beginning there. Wherefore, seeing we're also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, verse 2, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Verse 3 concludes and says, For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. We've already discussed the first 2 verses of this, particularly verses 1 and 2. And I can remember as we did that, we discussed basically this context under about 3 headings. We spoke of how to run the race. We said, number 1, that you run the race with the support of others. That was primarily verse 1, and speaking of that cloud of witnesses. Then we often went on to the second part of verse 1 and said that we run the race after the separation of sin. And remember, when we mentioned that there are things that are absolutely sinful, and those things are harmful to us. But then more times than not, we encounter things that are not sinful and harmful, but yet they're only hindrances. They keep us from God. And you cannot run a race if you're weighted down. You cannot run a race if anything's holding you back. And so we separate from those things. And then finally, we began a discussion there from verse 2, and we're going to conclude in verse 3, where we decided that you run behind the Savior of us all. To go back and repeat what was said there in verses 2 and 3 again, you'll notice with me that it said, And looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising shame, and was set down on the right hand of God. Now today's verse, verse 3, For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. I want to focus your attention primarily on the first 3 words, for consider him. Friends, the word consider here that we use daily, probably, we use it often at least, is a word that literally means to take examination. It literally means to take a sample of, or to make an example of. And that's what God ought to be. That's what Christ was on the cross when he endured those afflictions, when he dealt with all the things that surrounded his crucifixion, his trial, his death, burial, and even his resurrection. He did all of that for us. That agonizing evening he spent in the Garden of Gethsemane, when it was that his sweat was as were droplets of blood, he was in such distress and such pain. When it was that all of those soldiers were marching across the hill, Jesus was enduring that for us. And so when we go through difficult times, when we go through the tougher times of life, when we deal with things such as death and disease, we ought to consider him. Consider that no matter what I've ever gone through, whatever you may go through, or whatever anyone we've ever known has gone through, it's nothing greater than Christ. We need to consider him when we're in the midst of trials. Consider him when we're struggling. Consider him when we're under pressure. Consider him in all things. Friends, we can look down on ourselves. We can look to ourselves and become pitiful in our own minds, begin to think that we're the only ones that's ever done or dealt with this. But above all, Christ has. Christ has considered us. He considered us enough that he would be willing to save us if we're obedient. He considers us enough that He will uphold us if we'll only ask. Why don't you consider Jesus today? Consider Him by praying to Him, begging of Him that He would relieve your burdens. He may not do that. He may use those burdens to help you to grow so that one day you'll be strong enough to overcome. But if not, you'll one day find heaven for being obedient. Won't you just go ahead and do that? Consider Jesus today. This has been your daily dose. I hope you've been encouraged.